we're taking a compassionate look at just deconstruction and really helping people, helping one another, helping those we love pick up the pieces. Last week we looked at church hurt, and I don't know anyone who's either fallen away from the church completely, fallen away from Jesus, who hasn't had church hurt. In fact, it may be something that hasn't caused you to leave the physical doors, but it's definitely caused you to step back. And I would imagine that there may be many here today who've experienced that at some level, and it's got you at least questioning. And I just want to repeat something I said last week. Man, our heart is we'd love to be able to have the opportunity to walk alongside you and help you and encourage you and pray for you and weep with you. And it's a big deal. And I think I've been leading this church for almost 18 years now. And that's one thing I probably didn't anticipate. I mean, I anticipated a few other things, but I just didn't anticipate hearing the stories year after year about, just hurt and struggle and the pain that has happened in churches. And so we want to help people walk through that. And this week we're going to look at trusting the Bible. And if you're skeptical, if you have deconstructed or in the process, you probably have said or thought the statement can we really trust the Bible? Is it historically reliable? It feels culturally regressive and offensive and just personally irrelevant. And there's a few good things in there, but you can't take every word seriously. So what do we say to that? What do I say to that? What does the Bible say to that? How do we answer that question? Well, I want to take a look at that today and answer some of those questions. And I want to look at it and argue, surprise, surprise, that I believe the Bible is historically reliable. I think it's culturally reliable and personally reliable. And I want to talk a little bit about just some of how we can have historical confidence. And this may be a little, dry for you. It may feel a little bit like a seminar, but I think it's important. And just kind of give me a head nod every once in a while. And if I see you doze off, I'll just move on to something else, and that's fine. But I think it's important. I think it's helpful. And because a lot of people have come up and, they've said things and they've thrown a lot of shade on the Bible and cast a shadow. You can't really trust it. Who really knows if we have the original documents and, it's just been passed on and, like the big telephone game and who really knows if what we're reading is really what was written back then. And we can't really trust that. And, the political winners, a few hundred years later, just men wrote that just to consolidate their power and exert control over people, but the idea that Jesus was divine, that he rose from the dead, that he did miracles that people saw, these were just made up later on. And you can't really take every word literally. And there's been things that have happened over recent history that's caused people to doubt. I mean, one was Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, and in that he said the Bible has evolved through countless translations and additions and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. And for some people, that was like that, they just read that and it threw them. Now, I just want you to know that even scholars that aren't Christians and don't believe in the Bible say, hey, Dan was just making that up. There's nothing historically reliable about it. It's a fiction. That's not true. So that was easy to pass along. There was another group that had a little bit more traction, and they were called the Jesus Seminar, and they were throwing some shade on the historical account of the Bible, but that was somewhat easy to refute as well. I mean, like one of the guys who was a part of this, his name was Paul Verhoeven, and this guy was a movie maker, and he made such classics like RoboCop and Showgirls. And so I don't know that you could call him like a premier biblical scholar. And so you could kind of push him to the side. But there's been a guy maybe in the last decade who's come on the scene named Bart Ehrman. And he's one of the premier textual critics. And so just people who look at ancient documents. And yeah, if you think this is boring, listen to him. And so, but he's really smart. And in this world, I mean, they get into the detail. When I say they get into the detail, they get into the detail. And this guy is very respectable. In fact, I quoted him at our 25-year vision message. And he is someone who deconstructed from his faith. And he came out with a book called Misquoting Jesus. And he was famous for pointing out that there are over 400,000 variations, textual variations in the copies of the manuscripts that we have of the New Testament. In fact, he said that there are more variations in the New Testament than there are words. And he was on Stephen Colbert, he was on Jon Stewart, and they heard that. Well, who can really trust the Bible then? There's all these changes, there's all these differences. Can you really trust it? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's the quantity of these differences, there's a quality, and then there's the issue of orthodox. Like, is there any version that says, hey, Jesus didn't really rise from the dead? Is there something about orthodox about what we believe in these differences? So the first thing I want to say that one of the reasons why we have so many there are 400,000 variations. That is true. We're going to chat about that. And one of the reasons why there's so many variations is that we have so many copies of the original manuscript, which is a huge plus in the reliability factor. Like if we just had one copy, how many variations would there be? 0. So the fact that there's all these variations, it's kind of like me saying without qualification, Michael Jordan, if you don't know anything about basketball, Michael Jordan is a bad NBA shooter. He missed over 16,000 shots. In fact, I am a better NBA shooter than him because I didn't miss any shots in the NBA. And so there's a little bit of context there. Part of the reason why there's so many variations, because there's so many copies. How many copies do we have? Well, there's over 25,000 handwritten copies of the New Testament that we still have today. We still have 5,800 in the original Greek, which was written in, and 100, by the way, that we've discovered in the past decade. There's over 10,000 in Latin, and that became popular in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. And there's about 10,000 in the other languages like, Hebrew and Aramaic and Jordanian and Syrian as people around wanted copies of it. We have over 10,000 copies. Now, if you're to think about, compare that to other things that we know about, the ancient world, either 1st century Rome or 5th century BC Greece, all of what we know about that time period, those two cultures, I should say, was written by 5 men, basically. A few others, but basically written by 5 men. And we have 400 copies of their work. We have 400 copies. And the closest copy that we have from the original date that it was written is 300 years. And we have over 25,000 copies of the New Testament, and the closest that we get is less than a decade. And so the historical reliability of the resurrection of Jesus, for example, and that there was witnesses, and we have all this documentation, is unmatched about anything that you would learn in school about ancient history. It's in a category all of its own. Oh, by the way, there's over 1 million quotations from early church fathers, their writings of the New Testament. So like Ignatius of Antioch, he lived from 35 AD to 107 AD. Jesus was born, 0 to 4 AD, somewhere in the 30s. The book of Acts goes through about 65 AD. That's where the church history is. This guy was alive from 35 AD to 107 AD. So he's there. He quotes the Gospel of Matthew in his writings. And so you have other witnesses of Scripture beyond the Scripture itself. And so I want to, move us from two different ditches. One ditch, it's just kind of like despair, like who can really know anyway? That's not true. You can know. We don't just say, hey, was there even a Greece? We couldn't even tell because there was copies of this and it was 300 years. No, we know more about the New Testament and the events of the New Testament than we do of anything about ancient Greece or ancient Rome. So I want to keep us from despair, but I also want to keep us from I'll call it ignorant certainty. King James good enough for Jesus, good enough for me. Like, no, there's some things that we need to know that we can be sure of. And yeah, we don't have the original manuscript that Paul wrote, but we don't have original manuscript of anything. It was written on something called papyrus, which it can only survive in very dry areas, which we do have some of that. Some of the text, particularly, we don't get into this, but the Old Testament, some stuff that we know about the Old Testament and how it was preserved near the Dead Sea is one of the areas that gets really dry. It's one of the few areas below sea level. Some pretty amazing, nerdy things that you could read about. By the way, Dr. Dan Wallace, you want to write his name down. This guy's very smart. And if you want to just take a deep dive into this, you can, and you can learn a lot about what we know about the New Testament and even some about the Old Testament. A lot of what he's written is in the seminaries today. He's got tons of degrees and very sharp. Anyway, that guy. But so you have all these. What about the quality of the variances? There's all these different numbers. So we have all these different numbers, which is actually a good thing because we have so many copies of the New Testament. What about the quality? Well, 99% of them, this didn't get brought up in the interviews, late night interviews, 99% of them are neither meaningful or viable. Meaningful meaning like they change the meaning of what the text is, or they're viable meaning like you can really trust that it's a legit change. So for example, 70% of the variances are simply spelling differences. Not even spelling errors, like just there's more than one way to spell a word. So that counts. When I say they get into the detail, I mean they get into the detail. So when he gets on and says, hey, there's 400,000, there's more variations than the verses in the Bible, you gotta understand the quality. So 70% are like spelling, and then the other 29% that gets you to 99, for those who aren't following with the math, is that are not meaningful or viable. Now, of the 1%, there are some that are meaningful but not viable. For example, in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, Paul, wanting to communicate his gentleness with that community, says, I came to you like a little child. Well, we have one copy of the New Testament from the 14th century, handwritten copy from the 14th century, that says, I came to you like a horse. Now, that's a meaningful difference, but it's not viable. There's only one real, meaningful, and viable difference between these copies of the manuscript, and I hate to offend or disappoint the Left Behind people, but in Revelation 18, where it says the mark of the beast is 666, it might actually be 616. But there is no... I feel like I hit a nerve there. Jeez. There is no issue of orthodoxy that is affected at all. In fact, Bart Ehrman on page 242 of his paperback edition of Misquoting Jesus, in the appendix, he wrote, essential Christian belief are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript edition of the New Testament. I don't know if his lawyer made him say that. I don't know. But that is in his book. But it's not in the late. So you have these things. I just want you to know, and we could go on and on, and 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 I really do mean and on and on. But I'm going to leave it there, and if you want to know, you can know, and you'll be astounded. In fact, when you think about the fact that Rome paid people to preserve the history of Rome, and there's less evidence of that, and we have more evidence of a movement that Rome paid to get rid of. It's pretty miraculous when you think about it. In fact, one of the things that we know, this is the oldest, it's called P52. It's the oldest copy of the New Testament that we have, and P stands for papyrus, and it's part of John's gospel. You want to read that? Go ahead. No? Okay. I'll do the English. You want to know what it says? You interested? I think this is kind of neat. Pilate said to him, "So you are a king." Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Are you kidding me? That's powerful. The remnant that we have. What does it say? Anyone, I am of the truth. And anyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Well, you have to ask yourself the question, how come all these other ancient documents are not on late night television being criticized, and when we have all this other evidence? I mean, the average Greek scholar would have 15 documents of his work that would probably go to here. If we were to stack all the documents of the New Testament, they would go a mile high. We have what some would say is an embarrassment of riches. There's tons of evidence, and there's other things like the length of time. So we read in Luke, it was read in Luke that, Luke said, hey, I put this orderly account, and you can go. I went and interviewed witnesses, these witnesses that were still alive, and he wrote that maybe 30, 40 years after the event. Paul was even closer. Paul said there's 500 witnesses that you can go. They're still in Jerusalem. You can go. This wasn't in a land far, far away. This was in the city in which Jesus was crucified. And it happened about 15, 20 years. He wrote that. So you have all this time thing. It wasn't just like years and years and decades and centuries later. It was written within the lifespan of when these things were originally written. Not only that, a lot of things the Bible says, for those who are kind of like, but it feels like someone made that up to control power. It's also kind of counterintuitive what the Bible says. So like if being crucified on a cross was not like a cool way to die. And that was reserved for criminals to communicate that you don't mess with Rome. And so to say, hey, our leader that you should follow was a criminal, doesn't actually make sense unless it's counterintuitive. Or the disciples, I mean, they're cowards. They trip up. They say the wrong thing at the wrong time. They don't look good in the Gospels. And then, you have the testimony of women. If you understand the culture context of all the culture of the day, Rome, whatever, is that the social status of women was so low that their testimony was not admitted in a court of law. So if you're like, she saw that person murder that person, it wouldn't even count. So why would you, if you're trying to consolidate power, say that the first people to witness the resurrected Christ were women, unless it actually happened? So if you think about it and get into it, you can get some more. But one of the things is like, you know what? Okay, it's true, or it's real, or it's accurate. I can trust that what I'm reading now is what was written back then. You can have that confidence. I really believe you can have that confidence. But I don't like it. It's culturally regressive, and it's personally irrelevant. It's offensive. Well, I want to talk a little bit about that in the time we have left. I cannot go down the list of everything that offends people about the Bible because, number one, that list is really long. And number two, that list shifts around all the time, which is actually one of my points. And you'll see here in a minute. I want to give you two ways. Actually, I got this from Tim Keller. A couple books I want to recommend. Tim Keller's Reason for God. He has a chapter on here that I find really helpful. Another book that I would recommend is a book called How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball. He says some really helpful stuff too that will help you make sense of the Bible if you're finding it difficult to read. The first thing I want to say, if you come to a text that's challenging, it's and you're like, oh man, this is culturally offensive and regressive and I don't like it. Number one, please consider the possibility that it doesn't teach what you think it teaches. I mean, one of the things that the disciples had on the road to Emmaus is one of the things that had them upset is that they thought the Bible taught something that it didn't teach. And they were very upset about it. And they had lost hope. But one of the things I think actually it's really helpful that this guy Dan Kimball brings up in the book How Not to Read the Bible is that the Bible was written for us but not to us. So it's all these different genres over all these different time periods, different groups of people at different times. It was written for us so we can benefit from it, but it wasn't written to us. There are reasons why they were written, and they weren't concerned about the things that we're concerned about today. They didn't ask the same questions. They weren't concerned about DNA sequencing, for example. Like that wasn't a thing for them. They had other questions, like, if we just got out of Egypt and we had to worship all these different gods, if we stopped worshiping those gods, will they still be mad at us? Those are the questions they were asking. And so you have to get behind it, and like, what about polygamy and all this kind of stuff? Those are some of the premier players in the Old Testament. What was that all about? And bride price and paying for women and what in the world? Hey, it'll take a little bit. I would just want to encourage you to be patient, that it may not say what you think it says. And there's just a lot to talk about. So I'm going to leave it at that, but I just want to give you that encouragement and to study it. And there's some books that'll help you. And of course, we want to help you understand the Bible. Now, of course, sometimes it says exactly what you think it says, and it's offensive. And just by the way, it was offensive to people back then. But here's something else I want to encourage you to think about. You may be getting offended by certain biblical texts because of an unexamined assumption of the superiority of our cultural moment. Most of us read a passage and we think it's offensive because our culture thinks it's offensive. And so we just think that's offensive. But there are some things that we think is offensive that if you go to a different culture, they think that's just fine. And there are some things that we think is just fine that they are repulsed by. And that's true historically in all different kinds of, you go back into, there were things that were very, very offensive to the culture of the day. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Oh, you mean that guy who has his boot on the back of my neck? Very offensive. And there's stuff. So for example, like the two classic ones, and we'll touch on this next week, is that a lot of Western people find what the Bible teaches about sex really offensive. Now, we love the stuff about forgiveness and let it go, turn the other cheek, 70 times 7. We love that stuff. That's awesome stuff. Golden rule, great. We love that. Don't like the sexual ethics stuff. Now, if you go to the Middle East, they're good with the sexual ethic. In fact, it's probably a little too loose. It could be a little stricter. They would prefer it that way. But this stuff about forgiveness, that they'll just take advantage of you. No, we don't like that. And they would be very, very offended by that because they have a different culture. Now, here's a thought experiment. Why is our cultural moment superior to other cultures? Why is our perspective superior to other cultures' perspective? There's something that's not true that actually has a little bit of truth to it. That's how heresy has legs, how it has momentum and traction, is that it's partially true. And there's a statement like, no one can really know the truth. You can only have your, version of the truth. And there is some truth to that, which is the fact that no one culture, no person has superior. And see, that's the thing about the Bible. It's not a reason to say that it's not true, but a reason to say that it is true, that it is an equal opportunity offender. And it offends everybody at once for different reasons. And actually, you see that played out in how the makeup of Christianity globally. Now, this may shock you. I've said this before, but if you've never heard me say this may shock you if you've not done your research. Christianity is the most culturally diverse religion in the world, and it's not even close. Most religions, this is true about most religions are concentrated where they originated, okay? And so like Islam is concentrated in the Middle East and Northern Africa, where it came from. Hinduism is concentrated in India. Buddhism is concentrated in Southeast Asia. Christianity, by the way, did not originated in the Middle East. You guys know that, right? It wasn't in Dallas, right? It was somewhere else. And so, if you do your research, you will discover that Christianity is the most diverse, most multi-ethnic, most multicultural movement in all of history. And let me repeat myself, it's not even close. So for example, here's global Christianity. 600 million in Africa, 400 million in Asia, 550 million in Europe, 600 million in Latin America, 230 million in North America. On the other hand, secular humanism, where most progressive ideals are born out of, and it is behind what you would call the deconstructionist movement, is very 21st century or 20th and 21st century, very Western, very white, very male, very educated, and very wealthy. That is the profile. In fact, secular humanists are 50% more likely to be male. They are 40 times more likely to be white. When you think about Christianity, you probably, most people think, it's just some, middle-aged white guy religion forcing stuff down people's throats, which I get that because, well, I'm a middle-aged white guy. Hopefully you don't feel like I'm really good looking, so it's like all, it's like, all the, but most Christians are not white Westerners, and they're not male. In fact, the most likely person globally to believe that this is the inspired, authoritative word of God is a black female. The picture of Christianity globally is not a white male, is a black female. In fact, if I would have thought ahead, if you were to think about 5 people who represents global Christianity, you would have 2 black people, you would have 1 Asian, you have 1 other, and you would have 1 white person. 3 would be female, 2 would be male. I just think that you should think about what you are deconstructing from, in which one has a cultural bias or not. You could be deconstructing the wrong thing. But finally, it's not just historically reliable or culturally reliable because it offends all cultures. It's personally reliable. This is the most important one. First of all, the fact that it would contradict you is like a good thing, right? If you want change, so like if you go to a personal trainer who doesn't tell you to change anything about what you're doing, about what you're eating, you may like that person, but it doesn't change you. The only thing that can change you is something that can contradict you. And who's going to help you when you hate yourself if nothing can contradict you? One of my favorite verses in the Bible is in 1 John where John says, when our hearts condemn us, God is greater than our hearts. When our hearts tell us we're ugly, God is greater than our hearts. When something tells us that we're not worth anything, God contradicts us. Somebody contradicting you is a good thing if you want change. The second thing is how you know you're in a real relationship. You know how I know I'm in a real relationship with my wife? Is we argue. We fight. There's conflict. She contradicts what I think and say and do. And I contradict some things that well, I better not say that. In fact, I'm going to go over here. And I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. But that's how you know you're in a real relationship. You're not in a relationship with a robot. You're in a relationship with a real person. Some people think, and I get why they do this, is they think if you really follow the Bible and you follow it to the T, you're going to become this cold, legalistic person that's judgmental, that nobody likes. And there is some truth to that, because there are people who, in the name of the Bible, do some terrible things and become cold and legalistic. But I would say it's not. It's actually not the opposite of a warm personal relationship with God. It is the prerequisite for it. And part of the problem is, and I hope we can change this, part of the problem is that when people read the Bible, they don't just read it wrong culturally or historically, but they read it wrong personally. Because they think it's about him, or they think it's about them, I should say. So we read the Bible, we think it's about us. It's what I should do. It's about following the 10 Commandments. It's about me. It's about this requirement that's put on me. So we just, I owe, it's off to church I go, and I got to do some stuff to make this angry, white, old, frustrated man in the sky happy. Jesus comes along. Here's their version of how they understand the Bible. Like, you guys got this all wrong. It's not about you and what you must do. It's about me and what I have done for you. That's what this thing is about. And from Moses through the prophets, he said how it is all about him. It's not about, you got to do all these things in the Passover to get it just right so God will be happy in the sacrificial system. It is about the perfection of the Lamb. The Lamb is good, you're good. It's not, David and Goliath is not about how you can overcome your giant, so go out there and get the big sale. You can do it. Go get your Goliath. It's about how no one qualified or was able to kill our real enemies, but there was one who did. He killed our greatest enemies of Satan, sin, and death. That he's the temple, that he's the Lamb, that he's all these things. He says, this is about me, and he comes on the scene, and he's like, if you're on that program where it's about you, you think you got to do good, you got to say that your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. If you don't know about the Pharisees, they were professional law keepers. They got paid to obey the law. And you got to be better than them. He says, I've not come to abolish that. I've not come to destroy and tear that down. I've come to fulfill it. I've come to fulfill it for you. And when you realize that this isn't about what you have to do, but you realize that the scripture is about what Jesus has already done on your behalf, like these disciples, your heart will burn. And you'll be a part of a real relationship, because you're not worshiping some made-up God that you made up or prefer, or someone else made up or prefer, but you be connected to the real God of the Bible. This book is not actually about the book. This book is about the author of the book, who loved you. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that he who knew no sin. We all like sheep have gone astray. And oh, can we count the ways that we have gone astray? And he laid upon the iniquity of us all. And he bled and died on that cross between two thieves for you and for me. And he really did raise from the dead. There are witnesses to that. We have historical reliability and all of that. But man, this is about meeting a real person. A real live person. And when you experience that and you encounter that, you don't just know it up here, but you know it deep in your heart, deep inside of you, that he is who he says he is. And if you've never met this person, I hope you meet him today. He wants to meet you. He's here. He promised he would be. He promised he would never leave you or forsake you. He's not going to knock down your door. He's knocking. He's not going to knock it down. But you have to invite him. We stand. Jesus, we thank you for living the life we could have never lived and dying the death that we should have died. Jesus, I pray that we would have a new revelation, goodness and greatness, that this is all about what you have done on our behalf, not about what we do. God, I just thank you for this miracle of your word. It feels supernatural almost. But God, we thank you. You just don't want us to know a book. You want us to know you. And I pray that for every man, woman, and child, that they would have an encounter with the living God.